Hi everyone, welcome to Project Hindsight Labs. It's a great pleasure to see you. I'm Michael Weatherburn, and we've got our special guest today, Dr. Jackie Gonzales.
Hello.
Thank you, Jackie. It's been great. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you before, and it's a really great pleasure to have you on this discussion right now. For people who don't know, Project Hindsight Labs is been founded with a very specific purpose in mind. On the one hand, we have people who are very skilled at historical research, teaching, and so on, who want to have an impact on real world issues, and they don't always know how to do it. On the other side, you have decision makers in organizations who want to draw on this kind of evidence and insight, but they don't know how to do it. And this is a great meeting place, both for speakers, me, and anyone who's able to attend, that we can all share ideas and make good contacts with each other. I really hope we'll stay in touch after this. So, without further ado, I'll introduce Jackie. Dr. Jackie Gonzales has a PhD in history. After this, she went working for a private research practice, which I'm sure she'll tell us about, and has more recently in Albany, New York, founded her own firm. And I'm sure she'll tell us about that too. So I think, Jackie, let's crack on, as they say. So just tell us a bit about your background, what led you to your current foundation of your company. What are the kind of goals and textures and problems to solve? Paint us a picture of your working life. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Michael. So yeah, my name is Jackie Gonzales. I am in Albany, New York, and my background is environmental history, and my PhD, I studied environmental history, and I studied actually a U.S. Federal government conservation initiative on coastal lands that the Department of the Interior, which oversees the National Park Service, had done. And so as I kind of started my professional life, I did some work for the National Park Service. I worked some for environmental policy organizations, and I really wanted to be applying what I was understanding and learning in my historical training to these kinds of real world policy governmental things. So that's what landed me at this firm. I worked for a firm called Historical Research Associates for about 7 years. And there, the bulk of our work tended to be environmental litigation or tribal or water rights litigation, which also hinges on natural resources and environmental issues, where we were often working for attorneys on these kinds of cases. And we can talk more about what that was. And then also histories and studies for the federal government, for the National Park Service, Forest Service, different land management agencies in the US that are managing lands on huge scales and like to have historical reports, both to understand how they're managing the land and how they want to manage it in the future, but also because a lot of those agencies, like the Park Service, Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, also have a cultural heritage component and want to understand the history of maybe groups that they have overlooked in the past or things like that. So do a lot of research for those. I specifically do a lot for the National Park Service also. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, perhaps it'd be useful to unpack some of the case studies of the kind of work you're working on now. We may as well talk about the present.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through the kind of work you work on? What's been a great success story, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about I guess in terms of environmental litigation and those kinds of things we do for attorneys. We're often trying to look for, it can be something like a contaminated site. Maybe it's a really specific contaminated site that needs cleanup, or maybe a larger site. In the US, the way the legislation works is they're called Superfund sites, and it's sites that have massive contamination from many potentially responsible parties. And what we do is we go in and try to figure out whatever the lawyers can't figure out. So we often get brought in whenever the line seems to be ending for them. And often it's kind of great as a historian to be in this position where your expertise is like, they see the value of our expertise because we are really good at digging through, finding information that seems unfindable, that is not on the internet and is hard to locate. And so in those cases, times we've had successes are things like figuring out that a certain chemical was used in a certain process at that place, or something about the manufacturing process. Or sometimes there's it can be something like establishing that a company realized that something was going on, even if it's they're saying something to the contrary. It just kind of depends. And for those cases, we find what we find and we give it to the attorneys, and they do what they're going to do with it. But we're not making the argument. We're just uncovering the thing, which is staying in kind of our lane on those kinds of things. Yeah. And then, yeah, for research I do for the National Park Service, I think some of the best successes I've had in that is when I'm mixing both documentary research and oral histories, and really talking to people who are in groups that have been historically marginalized or haven't had their histories represented by the government in a way that they that feels appropriate or right or okay, and bringing those together, I think tends to be the kinds of reports or histories that are right for the government that end up feeling like they're really successful.
Thanks. So actually, I'm having done a work for a legal client as well. This kind of smoking gun history you mentioned, it really rings true. I mean, just you get to the point where the research associates at the law firm can't do anything more, and then and we don't know what we want, we don't know where it is, and that's where you come in, right? And that's really exciting stuff. And it is unusual in a more kind of academic setting where history kind of continuously evolves infinitely to actually finish the project because you found the evidence of what you were asked for, and you can say here it is, and you're done.
Yep. Yeah.
I actually wanted to build on your points about marginalized groups. I mean, this is obviously more broadly in any area people are conducting history, we're becoming interested in fuller histories of countries, continents, regions, and so on. But some of the kind of accumulated sediment of historical weight in the areas you're looking at has been produced probably entirely by the colonializing powers. And this is an issue for historical research everywhere. If you're talking about land or water ownership from hundreds of years ago and your sources are biased in one side, how do you compensate for this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think historians all over the world struggle with, right? And the ways that I tried to, well, one, like, be part of communities of practitioners of other historians from many different groups who are all trying to do good history and good research that combats that. I think that oral histories play a big role, and it can be a lot harder when it's a 200-year-old history versus a 50-year-old history where someone was around. But I still think that kind of the oral history that exists in many, in my own family and different groups and in all of our communities still has memories from those older periods. So I think that really talking to people in groups who have felt not a part of whatever those government decisions were, I think can really, really be helpful. And figuring out how, I think the more historic context you have, like at least over here we learn in grad school, reading against the grain and trying to like get the best part of it. And I think as you build more and more historic context and try and talk to people in different groups all over, it helps. I do think that helps to kind of cut out the stuff that you don't want to pay attention to, basically, in a lot of this like built up history in these documents.
Thank you. So I would like a couple of questions I'd love to ask about kind of working trends, sectoral trends, just to give you a brief second to think about it before I tell you. So one will be on how is digital trends impacting your work in this area? And the second one would be more specific to you, would be if we're talking about waterways, land ownership, and so on. If and when climate change changes some of these, all kinds of weather patterns, land ownership, blah, blah, blah. And so, as we all know, how is history going to be productive, useful in that sense? When a river changes direction. I can't imagine this myself, and I imagine some people listening find this challenging as well. So, love to know more. So, digital trends, impact of climate change. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. For digital trends, I would imagine many other historians feel the same boat, where there's just so much more that you can access online, especially since the pandemic. And here in the US, the National Archives and some other archives really underwent some great digitization processes during COVID. So that was really wonderful. And found that some things that they could do, it is easier to make copies for some, or send someone something digitally. So less travel is good, I think, and having access to documents. But then I think another thing that we find in talking to law firms is, not everything is digitized, and and that we still end up, I think it almost makes our value even more apparent because when it seems like everything is digitized, the fact that we realize that it's not, and we know where to find the things that aren't digitized, I think it shows to our clients that we do have this skill, that even in an age of digitization, we're finding those things. But it's wonderful having so many primary and secondary sources online. And I think it makes the reports richer and fuller, and I think you can tell a more complex story. But I think you have to be, and kind of going back to the colonization point, though, to be careful not to only be relying on these sources and being sure you're talking to people too, since yeah, often written sources were products of colonizers. So let's not just be relying on those. And then I think in terms of climate change, um, and how it's history, I think, well, one thing that I think about, I was working on a project a few years ago that was down in the Mississippi Delta area where that river's been changing for so long, and it's always changing, and it's changed in the last 100 years. And one thing that I like as an environmental historian is putting it all into context, that we're seeing rapid pace of changes and scale of changes, but remembering that changes have happened, and that that is part of how the world works, and that's part of how the environment works, and I think putting historic context onto things can be really helpful in showing that it's part of these other changes, but also how the scale is different. And I think in terms of litigation and lawsuits and the kind of work we do there, I was thinking some of the questions you had sent before, how that we're seeing different laws now happen because of climate change. And so the way that attorneys or people are using the legal system to do things with the environment, at least in the US, it's really starting to change because of the pace of climate change. And so I think that's going to be really interesting the next few decades.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, regardless of what people think about climate change, it's a growth sector, for lack of a better phrase, and it should be. So it
Yeah.
means it just, I mean, for example, environmental history as a subject it has existed of quite a long time, but it's been very specialist and not well known, and it's becoming much, much better known now, I think, with whole PhD programs and so on. People writing just about the sea, for instance,
Yeah.
Fernand Braudel, this kind of thing, and that's become really fashionable now, and that's great, and it does enable us to broaden history and see it from different perspectives. I think it's really valuable.
Yeah.
Jackie, I've got in your, I mean, again, this is because I'm in the UK, we've got a lot of Europeans talking to someone in North America. What kind of, I mean, that we've got many elections in the year we're talking. Not just that, but also kind of incoming policies, trends, that kind of stuff. What do you anticipate might shape your work, grow it, challenge it? What do you think?
Yeah. I think kind of building, I think that the climate change is going to continue to grow that. I'm in the US, we're having things like Supreme Court decisions that are in some ways weakening older environmental laws. But meanwhile, there's new environmental laws being passed, but sometimes at the state level rather than the federal level and things like that. Like I live in New York, and a few years ago, a constitutional amendment was passed to giving everyone a right to a clean and healthy environment, which provides the basis for all sorts of lawsuits that previously there wasn't. So I think that's going to be a trend. I also think on the federal level, I work so much with kind of career bureaucrats who are very used to different presidential administrations. And one thing that I've seen just in my time with different administrations is often the funding or things actually are steadier than it appears in the news. But just kind of the key words that you use or the way that scopes are written kind of changes based on those political changes, but it's not necessarily that the work isn't being done still. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. We've got a question from Mark Pope here, who's from Imperial, a colleague of mine, actually.
Yeah.
And he, as many people interested in global trends, are interested in this kind of local, regional, national, continental, this kind of, how do you organize things? So his question is, do you work mostly on a local scale, or do you make links beyond that? I'm wondering how that local global dynamic works historically.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say I work not really on a local, but I would say I tend to work in kind of North American. Like most of my stuff tends to be in US and Canada. And I think that has to do with records and our legal system, honestly, because I'm doing a lot for the government or within the US legal system. And because we are so large and varied, I think I see a lot of different things to compare or contrast across the United States. My personal work isn't as global, but I wish it was, and I think that I see things in other countries, and I can see how learning from each other would be helpful. But I know that my work is so US centric that I'd love to know more about what's going on everywhere else. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'm sure some European, Asian, African specialists will be listening to this live or afterwards, and we'll get straight in touch. Mark says thanks. Speaking of historians of Africa, we have Duncan Money, who is based in Uganda, who has been one of the speakers on this event series. Absolutely fantastic researcher. Duncan, you have a question. Over to you.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi, Duncan.
I've been keeping my camera off as my connection is absolutely dreadful at the moment. And I'm once again on the road. But I was wondering, Jackie, you mentioned about the work you've done for national parks. And my question is most of your business coming through repeat business? Or do you kind of have that kind of a broad base of clients? Yeah, just thinking in terms of, the kind of the risks you take on doing this independently, well, as do I, in kind of concentrating work on a big client, which then, especially if they're a government agency, they could have a policy change and suddenly, they're not kind of interested in this stuff anymore. And yeah, how do you deal with kind of concentration risk if that is a thing you encounter?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd say that I'm relatively newly on my own. So and having been with the firm, you're kind of shielded a little bit more because that firm had been around for 50 years. So we had a pretty broad base of clients. I think, and kind of on that note, I think I'm lucky that I had been with the firm because I have a lot of relationships with different clients through that firm. Um, I I would say a lot of my work is with the National Park Service in the government world, and I know it's such a big agency, and there's people across the country with it. So I would say um, some is a little repeat, but it's also just different folks within that agency hearing about my work, or and then winning another project based on that, or bidding or being asked to bid on something because of that. And then I think with attorneys, they all have such deep community, like they're all meeting regularly, they have continuing legal education and things like that where they're talking to one another. So at least when I was with the larger firm, we would often get work because some attorneys had talked to other attorneys who then put work towards us. As an independent now, I think that a lot of my work is I'm trying to also keep relationships with the firms I've worked with other historians I know, because I guess in my experience I found that having keeping in touch with everyone and having relationships, being able to, okay, maybe I can be the sole sole contractor on this one, but another one, maybe I'll subcontract to a larger firm or something. That's how I'm kind of trying to approach it in a way that diversifies me and keeps things relatively steady, because you're right, like consulting on your own, it can be like drought or famine, like feast or famine. That's the phrase I'm going for. Yeah. So it's definitely a concern, but trying to have a lot of different irons in the fire.
Thanks, Duncan. Great question. And thank you, Jackie. It's perfect kind of insights into the work operating a small sort of business in this sector. If I may, Jackie, can we go a bit further on that point? So you live in a country with what, 300 million people, plus Canada. And, it's about the size of Europe, pretty much population-wise, thereabouts. And it's from my perspective, it's quite hard. It's been quite hard to build a network of people interested in this. There are loads of people out there, but what they don't, I find, do is sort of institutionalize. People use lots of different language. They operate within existing structures and don't always find it that useful, rather than setting up alternative ones and networking horizontally like that. How is the scene, as it were, in the US for this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's also kind of fragmented and through existing institutional structures. I've tried to find some homes within those. In the US, we have a National Council on Public History, which is for historians who work outside of academia. And it really should be, it's also Canada. So our Canadian friends always remind us it's not a national, it's international, but it's the US and Canada. And we have a consultants committee in that. So it's historians who are working as consultants. And for me, that's been a great community of practice. And I've really appreciated the support from those other historians, many of whom are working independently, some who are with firms. But it's helped me find work. It's also helped me just have a group of people to commiserate with or to think about how to do things better with. And then I think a lot of historians who work on litigation, especially environmental litigation related things, go to meetings with environmental attorneys. And so some people know each other from those kinds of things. But I'm really excited to be here because I think that's so national, and it's not, I'm excited to keep meeting people who are doing things in other parts of the world and different kinds of work too.
Thank you, Jackie. I mean, me too. Me too. That's why I was really excited when we first met. And Duncan Money's written in the comments, the Consultants Committee is a fascinating idea / resource. I believe in North America, I'm a member of the of the Business History Council Conference, Business History Conference, that's it, which had a kind of, I love this phrase, other gets used a lot. So it was historians operating in other sectors or something like this. And so, yes, it was covering this area, but it was treating it as though it's a kind of temporary outlier rather than trying to formulate something which exists for a long time in the future, which I think is really something I'm excited to do. If anyone's got any more questions, let me know. Maybe we'll all be seeing each other in the future on the consultant committee somewhere in Europe or Africa or something like this. And that would be great. I mean, is there anything else you'd kind of like to? Actually, no. Before we get on to the anything else, I think like kind of we haven't really touched on what the environmental topics are, apart from there are rivers, right? I mean, what kind of cases are we talking about? You know, energy companies, fertilizer stuff, that waterways. What do you think?
All sorts, yeah. Often it's and it's kind of the way the cases come is based on how the environmental laws are written, right? And so in the US, a lot of times it ends up being waterways or things that go into navigable waters. So if there's some kind of chemical that is in a waterway that they know is in a waterway, and or many chemicals that are, and someone needs to be on the hook to clean it up based on our environmental laws. And so all the companies who used to have things there basically all lawyer up and try to figure out like who is going to have to pay for what. And so on those, we're doing a lot for like trying to find specific, like how different because the scientists figure out what was in the river. We're not doing that. We're figuring out where did they come from, what processes were used, who used what, that kind of thing. And also in some cases it's so some cases it's things like that, or a contaminated site, like someone's trying to buy a piece of land and there's definitely something there, and they've had scientists figure that out and they want to know what happened to put it there, and then we'll come in. And it can be also broader things too, like just all of our projects are confidential, which is why I'm kind of talking like, but it can be broader things about different environmental processes where maybe some attorneys want us to figure out like what did people think about that kind of thing, and we're trying to establish what public opinion was about something at a certain time because that's how they're making a case, or things like that. It can really vary, honestly. Or water rights, looking at like how historic water rights were used, or treaty rights for indigenous nations, and then how things were, not met, or things like that to establish historic precedents.
Thanks, Jackie. I mean, I'm just, as you were speaking there, I was just imagining a map of the globe circa sort of 1800 or maybe 1750, something like this, and imagining people moving from Europe and defining essentially the structures we still have today, be they the lines on the map, be they kind of institutes, sort of education systems, governments, and that kind of thing that we still have today in one way or the other in many places. And I was just imagining, as we've been talking about this kind of international, global relative to local, national. And, it strikes me, finding people at particular nodes who work on this could be really valuable to build up a sense of a global history of, that kind of, I know people do write histories like this, but with this purpose in mind, with a particular audience in mind. Also, I've been reading it. You won't be able to read it, everyone, but that is a list of the mega project cost overruns, with at the very top is nuclear waste. Apparently, nuclear waste projects overrun by 238% on average. And I don't know why, but this is somewhere where let's hope in 200 years that we've got a good map of where all the nuclear stuff was put, because I mean, this is the sort of equivalent of what Jackie's talking about here, but perhaps in relation to chemical spills and so on. Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Has anyone got any points they want to make, or shall we continue to speak for a few more minutes about any final points? Okay, I'm getting a sense. I mean, what's really, if I might tie this together, Jackie, when we did spoke with Duncan Money as well, he said some things you have. Oral history as an antidote to very bureaucratic sources. The notion of how to, what was it? Yeah, the small business aspects, which is very important, and that's one of the things I really wanted to extract from our speakers, because I think that's probably the most opaque and intimidating area for most researchers who might want to move into this area. But also the kind of issues of historical justice, which you know is very prominent in debate about history now. And also, you know, preservation of heritage and so on. This debate is daily in the UK right now, and I'm sure it's in the United States and many other places. And also the issue of, I get a sense of enormity. Well, now you've worked on this kind of thing, most of which has been under NDAs, as I think they're called in the US as well, non-disclosure agreements. It's hard to convey when you realize the size of the world and the challenges it faces. You think, okay, if I can contribute meaningfully, I'm both talking to you and talking to everyone now. If I can contribute meaningfully to this, it can really make stuff work better. And it's hard to convey this sometimes. So, you know, personally, I don't know, Jackie, have you thought about doing so, I mean, we've got a question now, so I'll just very briefly ask this, but it's one of the reasons why I felt the need to put out some videos, some reports and so on, because most of the stuff I do is behind other people's computers, cybersecurity, and I can't do anything with it.
Right,
Do you, I mean, have you thought about ways of sort of dissemination and so on that you can further tell people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know, because I think on the on the litigation related things, it's so hard. And I think things like this, where I can share general knowledge and we can talk through it, are one thing. And I feel lucky too that I do work for the National Park Service that is public facing, and a lot of those are ones where I'm doing oral histories and really trying to write histories of previously marginalized groups and kind of change national narratives that the National Park Service is telling. So I think for me, I'm really grateful that on that side I can be doing that publicly at least. And I don't know, I think I also in my personal life kind of I have my own activism in my own life that I think is probably informed by a lot of the research I do in a not specific way, you know. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great idea to link the different projects together and to find satisfaction in working on a similar problem, but from very different angles. We've got a question here. We've got a couple minutes. Mark Pope again. On historical justice relating to climate justice, have you been involved in climate change litigation? I guess this kind of litigation may be quite recent.
Yes, but I can't talk about specifics on anything. But yes, I would say like it's in the US. I've been involved in legislation that's specifically climate related. I know my firm has also I know many firms that have been doing this kind of work, and I think it's just happening increasingly because people are bringing these sorts of lawsuits from all sorts of angles, and it's a really interesting space. And I think one things even like just following environmental attorneys on LinkedIn or in other spaces like that, you'd learn a lot about what's going on if it's something of interest. And I'm sure, and now I'm thinking I would love to know what's going on in other nations and across the world, because in the US there's a lot of climate litigation going on, and they have a lot of attorneys have definitely seen the value of historians and kind of establishing like historic, I guess changes or different how things have changed over years, how people have perceived things. There's a lot of ways I think that historians can be of value in this rapidly changing world to show how things were and how they're changing now.
Thank you very much. And Mark says thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
We've got a short time. Is there anything else you want to add, to advertise, to tell us about?
I don't know. I'm looking at my notes here. I think. Oh, one thing that you sent me in a few just like brainstorming questions that you'd sent, which I appreciate, was something I wish I had known starting out. And one thing I wish I had known as like getting my PhD, just that our skills as historians are very valuable skills across many sectors. And I don't feel like I had that confidence, and I feel like I was always trying to show that. But I wish I'd had more opportunities like this to talk to people who are working across different sectors, using skills that they had as historians, that they had developed as historians, like research and writing and oral histories, things like that. And I wish I had I had just known how, like you said, rather than just, oh, it's other, like, no, the historians are working across everywhere, doing all sorts of great work. And it's not, I don't need to prove in some tiny way that it's valuable. Like, we have very valuable skills across sectors. And I hope anyone who's starting out now sees that and talks to people, like reach out to me, to others, and talk to one another.
Thank you, Jackie. That's a really positive note to end on. Absolutely do reach out. One of the purposes of this is to highlight people doing this, and you can get in touch with them. Usually, people who are entrepreneurs often tend to be very obviously visible on the internet. Well, obviously, you've got to advertise, right? And they trust me, I can't speak for Jackie, but people want to speak to you, whoever you are,
Yeah.
because right, just believe me on this one. So it's this people who move maybe from an academic sector, they're not exclusively, can sometimes this kind of thing. I'll bump into a conference next year and I'll do this thing and like just speak to them today. Yeah. I mean, Jackie and I are talking from thousands of miles away from each other, and it's for free, right? So as she said, also the digital technology has flattened. Even in the last 10 years, I would say I was in the US National Archives, Canadian National Archives for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, and now I can just send $100 to someone in Detroit and they digitize sources and send them to me. And yeah, it is amazing. And so thanks. And it is, I think, making this kind of work even more viable, because you shave out all of the travel time and expenses and you can pass it on as value to the client, right?
I agree. I definitely agree. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Jackie, thanks so much. Thanks for being so informative and inspirational as well. I love Americans because I was always looking forward about stuff, right? So thank you for being part of this. We'll stay in touch and look forward to hearing about your next projects. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks, Michael, for having me.
Cheers.
Right.